The word community, doesn't it just conjure up this really warm, almost cozy feeling?
It really does.
Like a place of strong bonds where people look out for each other, maybe a bit of a lost paradise vibe.
Yeah.
Especially now, in our modern, often hyper-individualistic world, that dream feels incredibly appealing right
It
now.
absolutely taps into something fundamental, that need for connection. And, that powerful ideal has been a major driving force behind a pretty significant movement right here in Korea.
Totally. Since the early 2000s, we've seen this huge wave of community-making efforts. Think about the big projects like the Seoul City Village community initiatives under former Mayor Park Won-soon.
Right. Those were really highlighted at the time.
Yeah, they were really held up as examples of citizen partnership, a shift away from purely top-down government programs. They even became models that spread nationwide.
They were certainly designed with a lot of optimism, aiming to build that sense of collective action and belonging, particularly in dense urban environments where maybe traditional ties might be weaker.
And that whole effort, that context, is precisely the backdrop for our deep dive source today. We're unpacking the book A Young You, which translates to something like The Sensibility of Community. It's by researcher and activist Gu Hyun-ju, and it's based on her pretty extensive research and interviews looking into these very projects.
Yes, and she doesn't really hold back. The core mission of this deep dive, kind of following her lead, is to really challenge that initial optimistic picture. Can community truly be manufactured or, made through policies, even well-intentioned
Or
ones?
through these government-backed projects. It
Exactly.
sounds like she's forcing us to peel back that often lovely-sounding ideal and confront some, well, uncomfortable truths about what actually happens on the ground.
That's the idea.
So this isn't a celebration of success stories. It's more a deep, critical look at the blind spots and contradictions she uncovered in her work.
Precisely. It asks us to move past the hopeful narrative and look at the complex, sometimes messy reality.
Okay, so let's maybe start by unpacking that initial romantic illusion she addresses.
Hmm.
The book points out that our common ideal of community often aligns with Tenney's concept of Gemeinschaft.
Ah, Gemeinschaft, right. That's the idea of a traditional community rooted in things like blood ties, shared place, deep personal relationships. Picture that idealized small village. And it's usually contrasted with Gesellschaft. That's more about modern, interest-based associations, like a big city or, say, professional networks.
And Gesellschaft is often seen as more impersonal, perhaps colder, more driven by individual goals.
That's the common perception, yeah. Colder, maybe more selfish.
Right. So the thinking behind some of these village community projects was almost like an attempt to infuse the warmth and closeness of that Gemeinschaft idea into the more impersonal urban Gesellschaft.
That was certainly the aspiration, injecting warmth into the urban coldness, so to speak. But the author's first major critique is directed right at this simple dichotomy. And crucially, at the idea of trying to return to some kind of pastoral past in our current reality.
Because, realistically, we live in highly urbanized, complex, modern societies. Trying to genuinely recreate a 19th century village is, well, she argues it's not just difficult, it's an unrealistic illusion.
Exactly. And her crucial point here isn't about dreaming of some bygone era. It's about accurately diagnosing the challenges and the flaws of community as it exists now, in our contemporary urban context.
So understand the present first.
Right. We need to understand the often hidden truths within these existing realities and then explore new possibilities from that starting point, not from some nostalgic fantasy.
Less about chasing a historical ghost, more about honestly assessing and addressing the issues in the community you're actually living in.
That's it. And that leads directly into her core analysis of the projects themselves, which she views in part through the lens of community as business.
Community as business.
Yeah.
That's a provocative framing. So when she looks at initiatives like the Seoul projects, did she find that they truly managed to shed their government-led origins? Did they become genuinely democratic, autonomous, resident movements?
Well, that's the central question she digs into. The stated objective, often referencing thinkers like Putnam, was definitely to build social capital.
Right, strengthen bonds and networks.
Exactly, strengthening those ties among residents. The hypothesis was that these improved relationships, friendly neighbors, would naturally lead to greater political participation and the development of local autonomy and democracy.
So friendly neighbors would become engaged citizens. Sounds logical.
It sounds like a clear path.
Yeah.
More connection leads to more democracy. But what did she actually find when she looked closely at who was participating?
Yeah, who showed up?
Well, the reality she observed on the ground was quite specific. She found the primary participants in these projects were overwhelmingly identified as women with interrupted careers and stay-at-home mothers.
Okay, that makes sense. In a way, these might be groups with more available time during the day, perhaps.
That's a reasonable assumption. But then, logically, the types of programs offered would naturally cluster around activities relevant to their lives, right?
Ah, so the focus shifts.
Precisely. The focus tended to be on activities like joint childcare, shared cooking, maybe neighborhood cleanups. And while these activities are valuable in themselves, the author highlights some negative consequences arising from this specific demographic concentration.
Like reinforcing stereotypes, maybe?
Yes. She points out that this focus reinforced the existing care work paradigm, effectively tying these community activities even more strongly to traditional women's roles.
Which could limit the scope and perception of what community work even is.
Exactly. And I can see how that would inadvertently exclude others. If the programs are mostly childcare or cooking, well, it's much harder for single people or those working long hours or even men interested in different types of engagement to feel welcome or, frankly, able to participate.
Yeah, the structure itself creates barriers.
Absolutely. The projects became less inclusive than the broad ideal of community might suggest, and her critique goes further into the operational side. She found that when procedures were simplified, maybe to lower barriers to entry, it unfortunately opened the door to negative side effects.
What kind of side effects are we talking about?
Well, the source mentions instances of alleged financial distortion, things like program instructors potentially colluding with associates to inappropriately manage or even split grant money intended for community activities.
Oh, wow. So funds meant to build trust and social capital could have actually been diverted.
That's the concerning finding she highlights, and this is where she points out a deep paradox. The very goal of fostering democratic development and trust within the community was, in some instances, undermined by the internal processes and dynamics of the projects themselves.
Through this exclusion and potential financial mismanagement. That's a really sharp critique. The process itself contradicts the stated goal. So based on these findings of exclusion and distortion, what kind of solutions or systemic changes does she suggest are needed?
She argues for pretty fundamental structural shifts. Urgent necessities include things like shorter work hours across society.
Which would free up time for more people.
Right, genuinely free up time for a more diverse range of people to participate. She also stresses the need to actively challenge and change outdated ideas that confine care work and, community engagement primarily to women. And critically, she says, we need to closely examine if these community projects, as they were implemented, are actually worsening social capital polarization.
Yeah, so.
Like, are they primarily benefiting those who already have the time and resources to participate, while leaving others further behind, more disconnected?
Okay, so it's not just about tweaking the projects themselves.
Right.
It's about looking at broader societal structures and cultural assumptions. Now, moving on, the book also looks at another key hypothesis behind these projects. The idea that supporting small group activities, maybe a bowling club or a book group, something like that,
Right.
could foster civic awareness and gradually expand into engagement in the broader public sphere, sort of starting small and growing outwards.
Yes, the theory was that creating these zones of intimacy around shared hobbies or interests would build trust and relationships.
And those relationships would be the foundation.
Exactly. They'd serve as a foundation, naturally prompting participants to discuss village-wide issues and transition into engaged citizens participating in a local public sphere.
Makes sense in theory, but did she find that natural expansion happening on the ground?
Well, according to her research, often not. She observed that many participants were actually quite content with their hobby-level activities within their small groups.
Just happy with the group itself.
Yeah, satisfied with the intimacy and shared interest, but they struggled, or perhaps simply weren't inclined, to expand their focus or energy to broader village-wide issues or more formal civic engagement.
So their connection within the small group didn't necessarily translate into concern or action for common problems affecting the whole neighborhood. Like the jump wasn't made.
Exactly, which effectively neutralized the original aim of using these small groups as a stepping stone to develop more broadly engaged democratic citizens. But her critique in this area gets even more troubling.
Oh, that's so.
She found that conflict and power struggles actually erupted within existing civil society groups.
Really?
Yes.
Hmm.
These groups reportedly began vying intensely for the resources and influence associated with the community project funding.
So instead of fostering cooperation, the projects sometimes triggered competition among established groups for funding and power.
That's the picture she paints. And here's what she highlights as particularly shocking. Instead of supporting the emergence and growth of new resident movements or individual participation.
Which you'd think would be the goal.
Right. Some established civil society groups allegedly acted to hinder the entry and growth of these newcomers, specifically to secure their own position and power base within the project system.
Wow, that feels fundamentally counter to the whole spirit of building broad community engagement.
It really does, and this leads her to a very sharp criticism. The community sites and projects, which were intended to be free public spheres for open debate, democratic participation, and the emergence of new voices, instead transformed into what she calls mutated public spheres.
Mutated public spheres. What does she mean by that exactly?
She describes them as spaces where, instead of robust and honest discussion, participants and groups felt compelled to sort of cover for each other's weaknesses or simply stay silent.
Why? To keep the peace or keep the funding.
Perhaps to maintain relationships, access to funding, or just avoid conflict. It became a distorted version of a public forum where genuine critical engagement was suppressed.
So the very places designed to foster democratic dialogue ended up kind of stifling it, turning to something quite different.
Precisely. And she connects this dynamic back to a larger risk she identifies.
And that risk is?
She warns that community projects, even those initiated with the best intentions, can inadvertently become tools for state governance. A framework referencing the work of Barbara Cruikshank for citizen-making.
Citizen-making. Like the state trying to shape or produce a particular type of citizen, not just enable citizens.
Exactly. Not empowering organic citizen-led action, but rather attempting to engineer citizens whose activities align with state goals or processes, potentially making them easier to manage or control.
Does the book give specific examples she observed that suggest this danger is real?
Yes, it does. One phenomenon she highlights is how personnel specifically trained for village building or community organizing were later absorbed into temporary government positions. The Chilean term she notes for this is O.
OI. What does that mean literally, and why is it a sign of risk?
Odo is a shorthand, roughly meaning accidentally civil servant. It refers to people hired on short-term project-based contracts, often from the community sector, who effectively end up working for the government or government-backed entities in a kind of quasi-official capacity.
Oh, okay.
And she sees this as a risk because the very people intended to be independent catalysts for community action end up integrated into and dependent upon the state system they were meant to interact with.
Which could leave genuine grassroots fieldwork understaffed.
Yes, and compromise their independence. They shift from potentially critical partners to essentially dependent employees.
That makes sense. They lose that critical distance.
Exactly. Another sign she points to is when entities within civil society groups that should ideally be able to challenge or partner with the state from a truly independent standpoint instead become deeply reliant on the project funding structure.
So they become dependent.
Yeah. That dependency makes robust critical engagement or independent action extremely difficult, maybe impossible.
That dependence must create a powerful pressure to conform or stay silent, feeding right back into that mutated public sphere idea you mentioned.
Absolutely. And her analysis is that this happens in part because community itself becomes commodified.
Commodified. How so?
It gets integrated into a logic of efficiency, measurable outcomes, securing funding, often through channels controlled by the state or established groups. The focus shifts from the complex, ongoing process of human connection and autonomy to just delivering project deliverables within a set time frame and budget.
So it becomes another item in the market of social services almost.
Kind of, yeah, losing some of its organic nature.
This paints a much more complex and frankly challenging picture than that initial warm, fuzzy feeling we started with. So given all these critiques, the exclusion, the distortion, the risk of absorption into capital, how does the book suggest we can possibly move forward?
Right.
How can we restore what she sees as the essence and healthy sensibility of community? This feels like the crucial question the book leaves us with.
It really is. And she offers a compelling, though maybe slightly paradoxical, idea. She uses the metaphor, the we in our cage.
The we in our cage. What does that metaphor capture?
It highlights how an overemphasis on defining a strong we identity, drawing clear boundaries around who is in the community, can actually draw rigid lines against outsiders.
Creating an us versus them.
Exactly. And this leads to isolation, becoming trapped within that defined space, that cage of us, which ultimately can lead to stagnation and decline for the community inside the cage.
So being too focused on identifying and protecting the group's internal identity can ironically end up harming the group itself by cutting it off.
Precisely. It becomes insular, resistant to change or new input. And
Right.
building on the philosopher Maurice Blanchot, the author presents a seemingly counterintuitive idea for getting out of this trap. We may actually need to abandon community to save it.
Abandoned community, that sounds incredibly radical, maybe even defeatist.
She's careful to clarify. This doesn't mean giving up entirely or dissolving all forms of connection. It's more about recognizing what has polluted, distorted, or trapped our current concepts and practices of community.
All things we've just discussed.
Right. The romantic illusions, the power struggles, the commodification, the insular way. It's about shedding those unhealthy elements and then desperately striving to recover the authentic, vital essence of human connection that community should represent.
So it's an act of letting go of the dysfunctional manifestations to try and reclaim the core idea.
Exactly. A purification, almost.
That requires a lot of brutal honesty about what's not working, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And she emphasizes that this recovery isn't a matter of just implementing a new project or finding some magic blueprint. It necessitates fundamental changes in social structure, a general readjustment of civil society culture itself.
Big picture changes.
Yes, and crucially, a continuous process of reflection and contemplation on what a more open, healthier community could look like. It's about the ongoing journey, the process, not a destination achieved through a short-term program.
So community isn't a static blueprint or a project to be completed. It's more like a living, breathing process,
Yeah.
always evolving.
Exactly. She sees community itself not as an abstract slogan or an artificial structure imposed from outside, but as life itself lived by diverse people, a flow of constant movement, negotiation, and change from within.
And if it's this constant flow, this process, where do you even begin to influence it? To push it towards a healthier state?
Yeah.
It feels huge.
Well, the author suggests it doesn't necessarily start with launching some massive initiative. It begins with small actions rooted in a renewed sensibility.
A sensibility, like a way of seeing.
Sort of. It starts with affectionately observing the immediate space where you live, really noticing the details, pondering the connections that are already there or maybe aren't there, and considering what small changes you could try from that point.
Like just paying more attention to your actual street, your actual neighbors, not thinking about community in the abstract.
Yes, exactly. The book gives some very specific, grounded examples. It could be simply noticing potential safety issues on a street you walk every day but maybe haven't truly seen before.
Uh-huh.
It could be questioning the meaning or role of, say, a disabled welfare facility located in an unseen or neglected corner of your neighborhood. Why is it there? Who does it serve?
Right.
Or it could be finding new meaning and connection by simply gathering and listening to the stories behind small, seemingly insignificant possessions of neighborhood elders. Just connecting on a human level.
Those are incredibly personal and concrete starting points. They're not about organizing a committee. They're about a shift in perception and maybe small, specific actions.
And this is her key point. She stresses that when these small attempts, born from that newfound sensibility, are made part of a continuous process of questioning, that's when a genuine, healthy community sensibility can awaken and grow.
Questioning what? Specifically, what kinds of questions should we be asking?
Questioning if our community is inadvertently excluding someone, questioning if honest, even difficult debate is genuinely happening or being stifled, questioning if the way things are structured or done is truly helping diverse democratic citizens grow and engage, or actually limiting them.
Constant critical reflection.
Exactly. When we consistently ask these critical questions, informed by that close observation of our lived reality, that's when we begin the difficult, ongoing work of recovering or developing a healthy, authentic sensibility towards community.
Gu Hyun-ju's book, Icheon-yang, truly sounds like a heavy stone thrown into the often calm, sometimes naive waters of how we talk about community today.
It really is. It forces us to turn away from the comfortable illusions and face the uncomfortable truths about what hasn't worked, the contradictions and the distortions within even well-intentioned efforts.
And by doing that, by facing those truths, it provides a precious, albeit maybe challenging, opportunity for genuine reflection. It pushes us to stop looking for a ready-made answer or some perfect model from the past, and instead start exploring new, perhaps messy, possibilities right from the complex point where we actually are.
It's a powerful call for honesty over idealism, I think.
Yeah. I have a feeling that after engaging with this deep dive, you'll likely look at that familiar word community with a very different perspective.
I'd imagine so.
It's less about just a cozy feeling or a perfect ideal, and maybe more about critical engagement, navigating power dynamics, recognizing exclusion, and engaging in constant, sometimes difficult questioning.
Mm-mm. That captures it well.
And perhaps, as the author suggests, the first step toward building a more true, more healthy community begins not with signing up for a project or joining a formal group, but simply with that slightly unfamiliar, newly critical questioning gaze at the very place you call home.